I found the photograph on a Tuesday in March, tucked inside a copy of Field Guide to Pacific Northwest Mammals that had been sitting on Grandpa's bookshelf since before I was born. The book smelled like mildew and tobacco, its pages swollen with decades of mountain humidity. And there, used as a bookmark at the chapter on unconfirmed species, was a Polaroid so faded I almost missed what I was looking at. A handprint, pressed into river mud, 5 fingers, opposable thumb, proportions almost human, except the palm was 14 inches wide, and the depth suggested something that weighed 4, maybe 500 pounds. On the back, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, Nooksack River, August 1983, the day everything changed. I was 16. It was spring break and I'd come to stay at Grandpa's cabin in the North Cascades like I did every year, expecting the usual: fly fishing, wildlife tracking, his stories about the old days. What I didn't expect was to finally understand why he'd wake screaming some nights, why he kept binoculars by every window, why he never, ever went into the forest after dark. Some answers you don't go looking for. They find you when you're ready to carry them. Grandpa's cabin sat at the end of Forest Service Road 39, 12 miles from the nearest town of Concrete, Washington, a place where the population sign hadn't been updated since 1987 because nobody new had moved in or out. The cabin itself was a patchwork of repairs spanning 40 years. Original logs from 1967, a new roof after the '96 storms, windows replaced one at a time as budget allowed. It sat in a clearing surrounded by old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar, the kind of trees that make you feel like you're standing in a cathedral. Grandpa had been a wildlife biologist for the Forest Service before retiring in '95. His specialty was large predators: cougar, black bear, the occasional grizzly that wandered down from British Columbia. The cabin walls were covered with his fieldwork, topographic maps marked with sighting locations, photographs of tracks and scat, notebooks filled with behavioral observations and handwriting that got shakier with each passing year. He was 72 that spring, still sharp but moving slower. His hands trembled when he poured coffee. He forgot things: where he'd put his reading glasses, what day of the week it was. But his memory of the forest was perfect. He could still identify bird calls, tell you which mushrooms were edible, read weather patterns in the clouds. We'd always been close. After Dad died when I was 8, heart attack at 43, the same age Grandpa had been when he took his Forest Service job, Grandpa became my anchor. Mom worked 2 jobs in Seattle to keep us afloat, so I spent summers and breaks here, learning to move through the wilderness like it was a second language. That's why I noticed the changes. The year before, Grandpa had been planning to hike up to Copper Ridge, a 12-mile trail he'd done dozens of times. This year, he barely left the clearing. When I suggested we camp at Baker Lake like we used to, he found excuses: bad knee, uncertain weather, too much work around the cabin. But I'd seen him split a cord of firewood without complaint. His knee was fine. It was the forest he was avoiding. I found the photograph on my 3rd day there, while looking for field guides to identify a hawk I'd seen. The Polaroid slipped out and landed face up on the floor. I stared at it for a full minute before my brain could process what I was seeing. "Where'd you get that?" I spun around. Grandpa stood in the doorway, face pale, eyes locked on the photo in my hand. "It was in this book. Is this real?" He didn't answer immediately, just walked over, took the Polaroid gently and studied it like he was seeing it for the first time, or the 1000th. His hands shook worse than usual. "Put the book back," he said quietly. "Grandpa, put it back, Alex, please." I'd never heard that tone from him before. Not anger, fear. I shelved the book and followed him to the kitchen where he poured himself coffee with hands that nearly spilled it. He sat at the table, still holding the photograph, and for a long moment said nothing. Finally, "How much do you know about what I did for the Forest Service? Wildlife biology, predator tracking. You told me. I told you what I could tell you." He set the photo down between us. "There are things I saw out here, Alex. Things that didn't fit in reports. Things that, when I tried to document them properly, got me reassigned to desk work and told to keep my mouth shut." I leaned forward. "What kind of things?" He looked toward the window, toward the darkening forest beyond. "The kind that watch you back." Grandpa didn't tell me everything that night. He was testing me, I think, seeing if I'd laugh, if I'd dismiss him as a crazy old man losing his grip on reality. Instead, I asked questions, careful ones, the kind that showed I was listening, not judging. Over the next 2 days, the story emerged in pieces. In August 1983, Grandpa had been conducting a survey of black bear populations along the Nooksack River drainage. Standard work. Set up camera traps, collect scat samples, document den sites. He was alone. Budget cuts meant solo fieldwork was common, camping in remote areas for weeks at a time. On the evening of August 18th, he'd been checking a camera trap near a game trail when he noticed something wrong. The forest had gone silent. Completely silent. No birds, no insects, no squirrels chattering in the canopy. Just wind in the trees and his own breathing. Every instinct I had said to leave, Grandpa told me. Sitting on the porch with a beer he wasn't drinking. You spend enough time in the wilderness, you learn to trust that feeling, the one that tells you you're being watched. But he'd been a scientist, trained to observe, document, rationalize. So instead of leaving, he'd investigated, followed a scent, musky, organic like wet dog but heavier, to a clearing 50 yards off the trail. That's where he found the first print. Biggest thing I'd ever seen, he said. 16 inches long, 7 wide at the ball, 5 toes, mid-tarsal break, dermal ridges visible in the mud. I knew bear tracks. I knew human tracks. This was neither. He'd made plaster casts, taken photographs, measured stride length, 18 feet between prints. Whatever left them was bipedal, walking upright and massive. The tracks led to a tributary stream and disappeared into shallow water. I followed the creek for 2 miles. Grandpa continued. Found more prints on the opposite bank. Found broken branches 8 feet up where something had pushed through. Found a daybed, that's what I called it. A depression in ferns and moss shaped like a body. Still warm. He'd reported it. Filed an official incident report with the Forest Service, including photographs and measurements. 3 days later, his supervisor drove 6 hours from the regional office to meet with him. Not to discuss the findings, to confiscate them. They took everything, Grandpa said, voice tight with old anger. The photographs, the casts, my field notes. Told me I'd misidentified bear tracks, that I'd been alone too long and was seeing things. Then they reassigned me to the office in Cedro Woolley. Desk work, no more field work, ever. Why would they do that? Because I wasn't the first. He finally took a sip of beer. Other rangers had filed reports. Hikers had complaints. There were sightings, encounters, evidence that something large and unidentified was living in these mountains. But the Forest Service had a policy, unofficial, unwritten, but absolute. Don't acknowledge it. Don't investigate it. And for God's sake, don't let the public panic about it. So they just covered it up? They managed it, like they manage everything else, timber sales, hunting permits, campground reservations. There are things in these forests the government knows about and doesn't want public, some for good reasons, some for convenience. He looked at me directly. But here's what they couldn't manage, Alex. They couldn't make it go away, because it's still out there. I've seen it 3 more times since '83, heard it dozens more, and every time, he stopped, swallowed hard. Every time I remember why I don't go in the forest after dark anymore. I should have left it alone. Grandpa had given me the warning wrapped in his story. This is dangerous knowledge. This ruined my career. This changed everything. A smart kid would have nodded, been respectful, and gone back to fishing and reading. I wasn't smart. I was 16, and convinced I was invincible. On my 5th night at the cabin, I took Grandpa's flashlight and GPS unit, and headed into the forest alone. My plan, if you could call it that, was simple. Hike to the location marked on the Polaroid, see if I could find any evidence myself. Grandpa had fallen asleep in his recliner by 8 p.m., exhausted from splitting wood. I left a note saying I was going stargazing by the creek. I figured I'd be back in 2 hours. The Nooksack tributary was a 40-minute hike on an unmaintained trail Grandpa had shown me years ago. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see by once my eyes adjusted. I moved quietly. Grandpa had taught me how. Placing feet carefully, avoiding dry branches, breathing through my nose. The forest was alive with sound. Owls calling, branches creaking, distant water rushing over stones. Normal sounds, comfortable sounds. I felt confident, even excited. This was adventure, the kind of thing I'd tell friends about when I got home. I reached the tributary around 9:30 p.m. and started searching the muddy banks with my flashlight, looking for prints, for anything unusual. The creek was running high from snowmelt, covering most of the shore, but I found a section where the water had recently receded, leaving fresh mud exposed. And there, my breath stopped. A print, partial, but unmistakable. 4 toes visible, the 5th obscured where the mud had collapsed. But the size, Jesus, the size. I knelt beside it, hand shaking as I held my own boot next to it for scale. My size 10 sneaker fit entirely inside the toe span. I was pulling out my phone to take a photo when the smell hit me. Musky, organic, overwhelming, like a wet dog had been rolling in compost and fur. It made my eyes water, and with it came the silence, that same absence of sound Grandpa had described. The forest holding its breath. I stood slowly, flashlight beam sweeping the tree line. Nothing, just Douglas fir trunks and sword ferns and darkness between. But I felt it, that animal certainty that you're being watched, that you're no longer the observer but the observed. Every hair on my body stood up. My lizard brain screamed, "Run!" while my frontal cortex tried to rationalize. Probably just a bear, probably just your imagination, probably. Then I heard it. A vocalization. Deep, resonant, starting low and rising in pitch. Not quite a howl, not quite a moan. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off trees, vibrating in my chest. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then silence again. I ran. Didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted back down the trail. Flashlight beam jerking wildly, branches whipping my face. I crashed through brush like a panicked deer, making every mistake Grandpa had taught me not to make. Behind me, or was it beside me or ahead, I heard something large moving through the forest. Not chasing exactly, pacing, paralleling my trajectory. I burst into the clearing around the cabin, gasping, legs burning, and found Grandpa standing on the porch with a rifle. "Get inside," he said. Not angry, terrified. I stumbled up the steps. He kept the rifle trained on the tree line, backing toward the door. "Did you see it?" he asked. "No, but I heard." "I know, I heard it too." We stood in the cabin with lights off, watching through the windows. Grandpa had his rifle across his lap. Neither of us spoke. Around midnight, we heard it again. That same vocalization, distant now, moving north toward the high country. Grandpa finally set down the rifle. "Now you understand," he said. We didn't sleep that night. Grandpa made coffee at 2 a.m. and we sat at the kitchen table while I told him everything. The print, the smell, the sound, the presence I'd felt. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he got up and retrieved a cardboard box from the closet. Inside were files he'd kept despite the Forest Service confiscation. Copies of copies, smuggled documents, personal journals. He spread them across the table like evidence at a trial. "I'm going to show you something I've never shown anyone," he said. "Not your grandmother, not your father, not my colleagues. Because once you see this, you can't unsee it. You'll carry it the rest of your life. So I need you to decide right now. Do you really want to know?" I was 16. Scared, yes, but also electrified by what I'd experienced. The thing every teenager craves. Proof that the adult world doesn't have all the answers, that mystery still exists, that there are frontiers beyond the mapped and managed. "I want to know." He opened the first file. What followed was an education in something that didn't officially exist. Grandpa had been documenting encounters for over 40 years. Not just his own, but reports from other rangers, loggers, hikers, indigenous communities. The files contained hundreds of pages. Incident reports, photographs, plaster casts, audio recordings, hair samples, even tissue samples from a creature that had been injured in a logging accident in 1991. The Forest Service has known since at least the 1960s, Grandpa explained. Probably longer. There are populations, small, scattered, declining, in remote areas throughout the Cascades, Olympics, Coast Range. Best estimates put total numbers at maybe 200 to 300 individuals, maybe less. Why not tell people? Study them properly? Because the moment you acknowledge they exist, they become endangered. And endangered means protection, habitat preservation, restricted access. Do you know how much money the timber industry makes off these forests? How many jobs depend on logging? How much federal land would become off limits if an unknown great ape species was officially recognized? He pulled out a map covered in red dots, each one a documented sighting or encounter in Washington state alone. There were dozens, concentrated in the most remote areas, far from roads and campgrounds. So the policy became, don't confirm, don't deny, don't investigate. Let people think it's mythology, make fun of believers, discredit evidence, and quietly monitor the populations to make sure they don't become a problem. A problem how? Grandpa's expression darkened. There have been incidents. Campers stalked, property damage. One case in 1987, never publicly reported, where a hiker was killed. Probably defensive behavior, territorial dispute. But it happened. And the Forest Service cleaned it up, called it a bear attack, closed the area for 2 weeks, and moved on. I felt sick. They covered up a death. They prevented panic. That's how they justify it. He closed the file. And maybe they were right. Maybe public knowledge would cause more harm than good. Hunting parties, habitat destruction, media circuses. Or maybe they were just protecting institutional interests and didn't care about the ethics. He looked at me hard. That's the dilemma, Alex. Now that you know this exists, what do you do? Tell people and risk their safety, both human and the creatures? Stay quiet and become complicit in the cover-up? Try to study them and end up like me, discredited and sidelined? What did you do? I documented. I watched. I tried to protect them in the only way I could, by respecting their space, by not pushing too hard, by understanding that some species survive specifically because we don't know about them. He gathered the files back into the box. Now it's your choice. I spent the next day reading through Grandpa's files while he worked outside, giving me space to process. The documentation was meticulous. 30 years of observations synthesized into something that felt less like cryptozoology and more like primatology research done in secret. What emerged was a picture of a species on the edge. They were nocturnal or crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, omnivorous with diet varying by season, salmon in fall, vegetation and small mammals in spring and summer. They showed tool use, stripped branches used for digging roots, stones used for cracking nuts. They had complex vocalizations, at least 15 distinct calls documented. Family groups typically consisted of 3 to 6 individuals. They avoided humans almost pathologically, but occasionally made exceptions. That last part haunted me. The exceptions. In Grandpa's journals, there were 3 accounts of prolonged observation, times when the creatures seemed to study him back. Once in 1985, watching from a ridgeline while he set up camp. Once in 1991, following him for nearly a mile before disappearing. And once in 1998, the most detailed entry, September 14, 1998, 6:47 a.m., Nooksack drainage. I was filtering water at the creek when I looked up and it was standing on the opposite bank, maybe 40 feet away. Female, I think, based on body structure. 7 feet tall, dark brown fur graying around face and shoulders. We made eye contact for approximately 20 seconds. Neither of us moved. I felt no threat. Her expression, if I can call it that, seemed curious, almost sad. She made a soft huffing sound like clearing her throat, then turned and walked away. Unhurried, deliberate. I believe she wanted me to see her. I don't know why. I found Grandpa on the porch, staring toward the forest. The one in 98, I said. The female. Why do you think she let you see her? He didn't look at me. I've thought about that for 26 years. Best guess? She was old, tired, maybe sick, and she wanted witness, confirmation that she existed, that she mattered. His voice cracked slightly. Or maybe I'm anthropomorphizing, projecting human emotion onto behavior I don't understand. But you don't think so? No, I think they're people, Alex. Not human, but people. Conscious, self-aware, capable of choice and emotion and something like thought. I think they know what's happening to them. The habitat loss, the isolation, the slow extinction. And I think some of them have decided humans should know they existed before they're gone. We sat in silence. Finally, I asked the question that had been building since I'd found the photograph. Are they dying out? Yes. Simple. Definitive. Logging has fragmented their habitat. Climate change is shifting prey availability. Their gene pool was probably always small. Isolated populations, limited breeding opportunities. And they're smart enough to know they can't win against us. So they hide, withdraw, and slowly fade. Isn't there anything to save them? He laughed bitterly. Save them how? Create a reservation? A zoo? Study them in captivity while their wild habitat disappears? That's not salvation. That's just slower extinction with better documentation. So we do nothing. We do what they've been asking us to do for thousands of years. He finally looked at me. We leave them alone. We protect the forests they need. We stop treating wilderness as warehouse inventory waiting to be liquidated. We recognize that not everything exists for human benefit or understanding. He stood, joints creaking. The ethical discovery isn't that they exist, Alex. It's that we've known they exist and chosen, every day in 1,000 small decisions, to let them disappear anyway. Because it's convenient. Because it's profitable. because we've convinced ourselves that progress matters more than mystery. He went inside, leaving me with the weight of that truth. I made the mistake of telling my best friend Marcus 2 days after I got back to Seattle. We were shooting hoops in his driveway and I couldn't contain it anymore. The experience was too big, too real, too important to keep locked inside a 16-year-old brain that didn't know what to do with it. So I told him everything. The photograph, the print, the sound, Grandpa's files. Marcus listened, then laughed. "Dude, your grandpa's been watching too much X-Files. I saw the print myself. You heard a bear, or an elk. You were scared and in the dark and your brain filled in the blanks." He took a shot, missed, grabbed the rebound. "Come on, man. Bigfoot? If it was real, someone would have found definitive proof by now. Camera trap footage, DNA, a body. Maybe they have and it's being suppressed. Oh, here we go. Government conspiracy." He grinned, but not meanly. "Look, I love your grandpa. He's cool, but he's also 72 and lives alone in the woods. Sometimes old people get confused." I wanted to punch him. Instead, I went home. That conversation taught me something Grandpa already knew. Truth doesn't matter if people aren't ready to hear it. Evidence doesn't matter if the explanation requires more intellectual courage than dismissal. I had documentation, personal experience, expert testimony from a man who'd spent his career studying wildlife. And none of it mattered because the comfortable explanation was that we were wrong, crazy, or both. I tried again with my mom that night. She was more diplomatic than Marcus but arrived at the same place. "Honey, Grandpa has always had an active imagination. That's why he became a biologist. He loves nature, loves mysteries. But sometimes people see patterns that aren't there. It's called confirmation bias. Mom, I saw the print. You saw something you interpreted as a print. In the dark, while scared." She touched my shoulder gently. "I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying human perception is unreliable, especially under stress. So you think we're both crazy? I think you had an experience in the woods that frightened you, and Grandpa has stories that give that experience a framework. That's not crazy. That's just how the brain works." I stopped trying to convince people. Instead, I went back to Grandpa's files. If personal testimony didn't matter, maybe physical evidence would. I scanned documents, digitized photographs, created a database of sightings cross-referenced with environmental data. I was building a case, not for my friends or family, but for myself. Proof that I hadn't imagined it, that Grandpa wasn't a delusional old man, that we'd touched something real. 3 weeks after my trip to the cabin, I got an email from Grandpa. No subject line, just a link to a news article. "Pacific Northwest forests face accelerated old-growth logging under new federal guidelines." Below the link, he'd written, "They're running out of time. Maybe we all are." I clicked through and read about new timber sales, expanded access roads, reduced environmental review processes, thousands of acres of old-growth forest, the exact habitat Grandpa's maps showed as creature territory, slated for clear-cutting over the next 5 years. I called him. "Did you see the article?" he asked instead of hello. "Yeah, that's the human reaction, Alex. Not disbelief, not skepticism, indifference. We can't even protect the forests we know have endangered species. What chance do creatures that officially don't exist have? There has to be something other. There is. You can choose to remember. You can choose to pay attention. And when you're older, when you have a voice people might listen to, you can choose to speak. That's it? Just wait. Sometimes waiting is the bravest thing you can do." I went back to the cabin in August, right before school started. Grandpa had called and said he had something to show me. Wouldn't explain over the phone. Just asked me to come. I found him on the porch at dawn, binoculars around his neck, a thermos of coffee at his feet. He handed me a second pair of binoculars without speaking and pointed toward the tree line about 200 yards out. At first I saw nothing, just forest. Morning mist, the usual movement of branch and shadow. Then Grandpa touched my arm and pointed more specifically. A gap between 2 large cedars where a game trail emerged from the undergrowth. And there, standing at the tree line, partially obscured by ferns but clearly visible in the early light, a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair. It stood completely still, facing the cabin, watching us watch it. My hands started shaking. The binoculars jumped so badly I could barely focus. "Don't move," Grandpa whispered. "Just observe." We stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably 5 minutes. The creature, I couldn't think of another word, didn't approach, didn't vocalize. just stood in that liminal space between forest and clearing, between unknown and known, existing in a way that felt both impossible and completely natural. Then it made a gesture, deliberate, unmistakable. It raised one long arm and held it there, not threatening, not beckoning, just acknowledging. A salute between two species sharing the same diminishing space. Grandpa raised his hand in return. The creature lowered its arm, turned, and disappeared into the forest. No sound, no drama, just the quiet transition from presence to absence. We stood there long after it was gone. "That's the third time," Grandpa said finally, voice rough. "Third time in 40 years, she's shown herself to me. Always the same individual, I'm sure of it. Same build, same movement pattern, same ridge scar above her left eye. Why? I think," he lowered the binoculars, "I think she's saying goodbye. She's old, Alex. Much older than when I first saw her in '98. She's leaving me a memory, making sure I witnessed her one last time before." He couldn't finish. "Didn't need to. What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing. We do nothing. Because that's what she's asking. Not intervention, not rescue. Just recognition. Respect." He turned to me. "Do you understand the difference? She doesn't want to be saved by human terms in human facilities under human observation. She wants to live or die as she's always lived, on her own terms, in her own place, even if it means extinction. Even then." He put a hand on my shoulder. "Some things matter more than survival, Alex. Dignity matters. Autonomy matters. The right to exist without being managed or studied or preserved in ways that destroy the very essence of what you are." We went inside and Grandpa made breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, moving through the familiar ritual while I processed what I'd seen. After we ate, he handed me a USB drive. My files. All of them. Digitized, backed up, encrypted. "Yours now. Grandpa, I'm 73. I've had a good run. But this knowledge needs to outlive me. You decide what to do with it. When to speak and when to stay silent. Just promise me one thing." "What?" "That you'll remember her. Not as evidence, not as proof. Just as a person who existed in the world at the same time as you. Who touched your life even though you occupied completely different spaces. Who trusted you enough to let herself be seen. I promise." He nodded, satisfied. Then I did something right. Grandpa died 3 years later, in his sleep, at the cabin. Heart failure. Peaceful. The way he would have wanted. He was 76. I'm 28 now, finishing my master's in conservation biology at University of Washington. My thesis focuses on habitat fragmentation in the Pacific Northwest and its impact on large predator populations. I don't mention unknown hominids. I don't cite Grandpa's files. But every map I create, every corridor I propose, every protected area I advocate for, they're all designed with margins of mystery. Space for things we can't name. Room for the unknown to remain unknown. The USB drive sits in a safe deposit box. I've looked at the files twice since Grandpa died. Once right after, when grief needed direction, and once last year, when the Forest Service announced new logging guidelines that would open up the last roadless areas in the North Cascades. I wanted to release everything. Post it online, send it to journalists, force the world to acknowledge what Grandpa had documented. But then I remembered his question. What do you do when you know something that changes everything? The answer isn't always speak. Sometimes the answer is protect. Not the truth, but what the truth represents. The beings who trusted silence over exposure. The spaces that survive specifically because we don't catalog them. The mysteries that die the moment we drag them into institutional light. I go back to the cabin twice a year. It's mine now. Left to me in Grandpa's will along with a note that said, "Keep watching, keep remembering, keep the door open." I've seen her twice more since that morning in August. Once at dusk, crossing a ridgeline 3 miles from the cabin. Once at night, prints in fresh snow leading past the tree line and disappearing into darkness. Each time, that same sense of being witnessed, of mutual acknowledgement between two species learning to share diminishing space. I've started noticing things the general public misses. News articles about hikers reporting unusual sounds. Forest Service memos about trail closures with vague explanations. Logging operations that suddenly halt without public reason, then resume weeks later after environmental review. Each one is a small clue, a hidden negotiation between official reality and the things that exist in its margins. The files show the population is declining, not rapidly, but steadily. Fewer sightings per decade. Fewer vocalizations recorded. Fewer prints found. They're not fighting. They're just fading. Like a signal growing weaker year by year until one day it's gone entirely and we'll tell ourselves it was never really there. But I know better. I carry Grandpa's memory and my own. I carry the weight of that final salute, that gesture of trust and farewell between species who should have been enemies but chose something else. Sometimes I wonder if I should do more. Release the evidence, force acknowledgement, demand protection. But then I imagine scientists with radio collars, news crews with cameras, tourists with selfie sticks flooding the last quiet places, and I understand why Grandpa chose silence. Some species survive by hiding, some truths survive by remaining unspoken, and some responsibilities require you to carry knowledge without the comfort of sharing it, to know something profound and protect it through restraint. I'm still learning what that means, still trying to honor what Grandpa taught me and what that creature showed me on an August morning when I was 19. That sometimes love looks like leaving alone. That sometimes protection means silence. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is witness something beautiful and let it remain wild. The forests still have eyes. They're still watching, waiting to see if we'll finally choose differently. If we'll protect what we can't understand instead of destroying what we can't control. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be honored, remembered, carried forward by those brave enough to know without needing to prove. This is my burden, my inheritance, the secret I'll carry until someone else is ready to understand what it means.